8 days after publicly collapsing under the weight of Olympic pressure in front of millions of people who expected him to win gold, Ilya Malinin walked back into the same arena that broke him, stepped onto the same ice where his legs had turned to stone and his lungs had refused to fill, and delivered something that no Olympic athlete has ever done before in the history of the Games. He stepped out not in crystals or a competition costume, but in a plain gray hoodie and ripped jeans, with the word fear printed upside down across his chest. And what followed was not a figure skating performance in any conventional sense, but a full visual reenactment of his own psychological collapse, broadcast live to thousands of people in the building and millions watching at home. The organizers made a specific exception to include him in the gala, despite his 8th-place individual finish, because they understood that a closing celebration without the quad god present was simply not viable. And the fact that they bent the rules to keep him in the program proved correct the moment he began his solo set and turned what is normally a celebratory no-pressure showcase into the most emotionally consequential thing that has happened on Olympic ice in a generation. He mimed doom-scrolling through hate comments. He flinched away from imaginary cameras. He retreated into his hood. He physically reconstructed every component of the mental breakdown that had occurred 8 days earlier, and he did all of it on the exact surface where it had happened, in front of an audience that had watched the original collapse and now watched him decide that silence was no longer acceptable. After acting out the complete visual destruction of his Olympic experience, he landed a flawless quadruple jump, then unleashed the backflip with a single-blade landing that had been banned for 50 years before the International Skating Union legalized it in June 2024. And the crowd went from witnessing something deeply uncomfortable and emotionally heavy to erupting into a floor-shaking ovation that had nothing to do with technical scores or competitive placement. NBC commentator Tara Lipinski said live during the broadcast that this experience would only make him stronger, and the visible emotion on his face as he came to a stop confirmed that the crowd was not just applauding the athletics, but specifically responding to the courage required to stand in front of a global audience and refuse to pretend that the worst week of your career did not happen or did not cost anything real. The final gesture of the entire performance was the moment that left the arena in absolute dead silence, because he mimed sliding heavy headphones over his ears, and the audio cut completely, and he stood at center ice in total silence, with 12,000 people watching him symbolically shut out the online hatred, the media scrutiny, the crushing expectations, and the noise of a world that had nearly eaten him alive during the worst 8 days of his career. That silence was described afterward as louder than any screaming crowd, a total reclamation of control, delivered without a single word, and the arena held it with him in a way that confirmed everyone present understood they were not watching a theatrical performance, but a genuinely human being publicly choosing peace over the chaos that had been consuming him. Malinin had also performed earlier in the gala as part of a high-energy group number with his Team USA teammates set to classic rock, and later teamed up with Adam Xiao Him Fa for a casual tandem backflip during the group finale. But everything else that happened that night existed in the shadow of the solo Fear set, which functioned less like a skating performance and more like a public therapy session that happened to include a quadruple jump and a banned acrobatic move. He told reporters after the performance that it was a physical release of the emotional hurricane he had survived over the previous 12 months, that the crushing blend of public pressure and private psychological warfare had reached a level that no athlete should ever have to endure, and that the gala was his way of making the audience look directly at what that internal wreckage actually looks like from the inside rather than the outside.
The Prague World Championships from March 23rd through the 29th is where everything this gala performance communicated gets tested against competitive reality, because Malinin is going for his third consecutive world title in a direct bid to join Nathan Chen as the only American man to accomplish that specific feat in recent history, arriving as the defending champion who experienced the most public collapse of his career 6 weeks earlier. He explicitly called it a redemption competition rather than a comeback or a return, and that specific word choice tells you that he has done the psychological processing required to arrive in Prague not as a fighter trying to forget what happened in Milan, but as a fighter who has confronted what happened in Milan fully and is now using it as the specific fuel that this particular competition requires. What Malinin accomplished between February 13th, when the individual event destroyed his Olympic dream, and February 21st, when he stood in silence at center ice having just publicly reenacted that destruction, is something that sports psychology researchers, coaches, and athletes will reference for decades as the most complete example on record of a champion choosing radical transparency over the silence that elite sports culture almost universally demands. No Olympic athlete in modern history has ever choreographed their own psychological breakdown on the same ice where it occurred, broadcast it to a global audience 8 days after the original event, and then immediately announced their return to championship competition with a word as specific and loaded as redemption. And the fact that Malinin did all three things in the space of a single week tells you everything about what category of competitor he actually is. The quad god did not break in Milan. He evolved, and the fear performance was the public documentation of that evolution happening in real time in front of an audience that had front row seats to both the collapse and the recovery. And when he arrives in Prague 6 weeks later to defend a title he has held consecutively since 2024, every competitor in the field will have watched that gala, will have read the Instagram post about invisible battles and redemption, and will have to process the psychological reality that a fighter who has already survived his worst possible moment is the most dangerous version of that fighter that has ever existed. The real story is not what happened in Milan. The real story is what happens in Prague when Ilya Malinin steps onto competitive ice for the first time since the collapse, and the entire figure skating world finds out whether what he built on that gala ice was genuine transformation or performance. And every indicator available, the word choice, the headphones gesture, the explicit redemption framing, points towards something that should terrify every single man in that draw.